fantastic weekend. Staying warm out there. Got a heater that has got an overdeveloped sense of purpose over here. Dang, this thing's working good. What's up, everybody? Everybody's having a awesome beginning to your February. So what this is kind of a continuation on a video that I put together, basically talking about the more value-based way of looking at modifying some of these Gen 3 Hemis. And the spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, the bottom line is that you want to take a look at supercharging realistically. If you're looking to spend any real amount of money, or if you're looking to actually make some real power. And nothing against camshafts, nothing against bolt-ons or tune only. But the reality is if you're looking to spend a sizable chunk of change, what's the best way to go about spending that money? And my argument was Supercharger. Whether it's a ProCharger, positive displacement, pick your poison on that. It doesn't really matter. The idea is what's the best way to spend your money. So I figured I would chat a little bit in the live show on that topic and explain why I was bringing up superchargers like the E-Force, why I bring up blower kits like the Whipple, and why I don't talk about swapping the Hellcat supercharger over. Why I'm not a huge fan of ProChargers on Gen 3 Hemis. And just basically walk you guys through some of the reasoning behind what I was talking about in that video. So let me say what's up to some folks and I will dive right in the middle of it. Rift is in, what's up? So the thing is when you're talking about supercharging, I want to run some things back real quick, because what folks don't really understand is there's a lot of misinformation out there that, although it's true-ish, the problem with true-ish statements is that no matter how you try to slice it, yeah, it's not exactly true, but it will kind of paint the wrong picture. So it can be partially true, but it'll give you the wrong insight. And that is that 6.4s can't handle boost. It's a complete fallacy. They handle boost just as well as any other engine. Really well. And it just depends on your fuel type and your preparation as to how well and how much power that 6.4 can take. Honestly, I think the weak link in that engine may be the rods if you were to actually pull the thing apart and with stock pistons just open up the ring gap. So I want to talk about ring gap in this to kind of illustrate some points for you guys. If you are in the camp that says, well, 6.4s can't really handle boost. Well, probably not if you're talking about just throwing a supercharger on the thing and turning up the wick. The 6.4 starts out life at basically 11-to-1 compression ratio, which is, well, would have at one point have been considered to be very high. And it is still pretty high, but you have to imagine this. The cars that 6.4 is going into are heavy. Lots of cylinder pressure, lots of load. And to keep those engines efficient, the manufacturer with the ring, the piston rings, is fairly tight. If memory serves me correctly, the top ring and the bottom ring spec is like 18 thousandths, maybe 15 thousandths, somewhere in there. And that might actually be a little bit on the generous side. Now, consider this. That's a large piston, a 4090 bore. It's bigger than 4 inches. Consider this. What if you were to take that same ring gap, because it's a percentage of piston diameter, and if you ran that same ring gap on, say, a 5.7, which it's roughly about that number, well, then you could potentially have more heat in the chamber. You can heat that ring up more. It will swell, but it won't ever touch on the 5.7 where it may touch or would touch, presumably, on the 6.4. Were one to actually go in and open up the ring gap in a 6.4, you'd be fine. Well, why don't you rewind that to another engine family, say an LS or a Coyote? If you take the same ring gap, which is still pretty tight at, say, 15 thousandths, that smaller piston, now that 15 thousandths represents a larger percentage of the diameter of the piston, which means that you can throw the kitchen sink at it, presumably, and not run into a problem with the ring ends butting up. So ring ends butt up, ring ends fold over, pop the top of the cylinder piston off. Then you get wrecked cylinders and wrecked cylinder heads. But the point of this is, no, the 6.4 can manage power pretty well. It's fuel quality and actual physical load that ends up stinging folks with the 6.4. 91 octane plus 4,600 pounds doesn't give you a whole lot of wiggle room just in terms of making outright power. So that's one thing that you want to consider when you're looking at the prospect of boosting one of those cars. You don't want to run a whole lot of boost through it because fuel quality just won't necessarily allow for it. Number one, because of the higher compression ratio, but two, the tighter ring gap could be an issue. But here's the thing, you don't have to throw a ton of boost at it to make significantly, well, let's just put it to like this. You don't have to throw a kitchen sink at it to make that car a whole lot of fun. 5.7 even more so. But that's one of the things that I wanted to illustrate. And by the way, the 6.4 got a bad rap actually quite a long time ago. And it started with Prochargers. Some of the original tunes were a little bit aggressive, and that was causing 6.4s to pop. So anyway, just something to keep in the back of your mind. It's okay to boost a 6.4. 6-7 pounds of boost will get you about 130, 150 horsepower to the rear wheels. Makes the car a whole lot of fun. Basically takes it to, on a eddy current dyno, somewhere just south of 550 horsepower, which is about 10% less than what a Hellcat will put down. So again, think of it like Hellcat light. But again, just something I wanted to touch on because that was like the elephant in the room. We start talking about supercharging these hemis, and you've got your limits. And of course, the issue here is that a lot of guys just simply will not put the money into the 6.4 if you're looking to boost the thing. Nobody wants to yank the engine, tear it all apart, open up the ring gap. I mean, at that point, you might as well just put a rotating assembly in it anyway. And at that point, you can boost its tits off, and who cares? Just go, 25 on the top ring, 27 thousandth on the bottom ring, and send it. You're in good shape. So, just wanted to touch on that here real quickly. But yeah, the power portion of that is pretty legit. You're going to be looking at somewhere around 120 horsepower no matter what kit you go with. So let me check in with you guys. DM is in saying, what up, B? Got the flex. I like it. Gary's in. Craig is in from Arizona. I like it. Jeff is in. Dad's Garage saying, happy Saturday. Happy Saturday to you. Riff saying his 08 SRT8 with a Procharger felt good, but his 09 6-speed SRT8 with a Procharger feels very sluggish. I think certain motors and setups and triple superchargers are just not the way to go. Well, I'm going to throw a guess out here. So here's the thing. So this is what I wanted to talk about. Like, what is the difference in feeling between the two types of superchargers and what I was talking about in the video that I made? The camshaft profile we're talking 6.4s now, but 5.7s as well. The camshaft profile on these engines has a very wide lobe separation angle. And what that does is it tends to try to push power further up into the RPM range, but it sacrifices torque down low and it sacrifices mid-range power. You can make up that with the short runner, long runner configuration intake manifold. But the point of this is that you're trying to drag power further up, and it also helps with idle quality. It makes the thing idle pretty chill and, streetability and all of that, high vacuum numbers and whatnot. So, what I've noticed with the Procharge cars is it's actually more what I didn't notice. What I did not notice with the Procharge cars was a real strong seat of the pants push because the boost wasn't really there. Contrast that, you're running 7 pounds of boost, that's half an atmosphere. You're looking at picking up Again, 150 horsepower to the rear wheels, which isn't bad, but it's not like you're getting 12 pounds of boost or 14 pounds of boost, a full atmosphere. That's where things really start to get interesting and where the car feels like let me just put it like this. That's when you really start feeling where your money has been spent. The low boost combinations, although they do make the power up top, you don't ever feel it down low. Not with a centrifugal supercharger, not the way that you do with like a Maggie or a Whipple. So, although they will show a better number on a dyno in terms of horsepower, and to be honest with you, in terms of just being easy and soft on parts, they're a lot easier and softer on parts. But what the penalty that you pay for that is kind of a bit of a lackluster in terms of how the car feels when you start really leaning on it. And that's the thing, you really do have to lean pretty heavily on those things. And honestly, and I've said this over and over again, to do it right, to really do it right, you need to spool that thing up to about 6,800 RPM at the minimum, in my opinion, for those engines before they really start feeling good. A lot of times that means you got to pull them down, which makes them even softer down low. So the idea is to be making peak boost at obviously peak RPM, but I've just noticed that a lot of those combinations always felt soft. So that was my over and again impression of those cars. Now you pull the thing apart, put a rotating assembly in it, or at least pistons and rods, throw some E at it, and now we're talking about a completely different combination. You run 14, 16, 18 pounds of boost through the thing, and that's when that car gets real nasty and real exciting real quick. But again, you just kind of have to deal with the fact that you've got, from the factory, a tighter ring gap and 11-to-1 compression in a car that is heavy, which is going to give you a lot of cylinder pressure, which means your tolerance for knock is going to be lower in those combinations. Stuart, thank you very much. Saying, what are the advantages that a 392 has over a Hellcat, if any? So, Stuart, it's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it as the former owner of an SRT and the current owner of a Hellcat. And it's funny you asked this question, because I was just having this conversation with somebody recently. Let's say we're talking about a Scat Pack shaker, probably number one or number two, kind of shares this spot, one of two favorite cars to drive. And the reason for that is the 392 is very snappy down low. It's got real good partial throttle response. The Hellcat doesn't. The Hellcat, you have to remember, is a full point and a half behind the Scat Pack in terms of compression ratio. And because of that, it's not that the Hellcat feels sluggish. It's just a little bit slower to respond. It doesn't have that pop to it the way that the 392 does, that eagerness. It just doesn't have that. It's one of the only ways I can describe the difference is the 392 is like, the 392 is kind of like the difference between a real stiff jab, between the 392 and the Hellcat. 392 is a real hard, stiff lead jab, power jab, compared to a planted left hook. If you're into boxing, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Power jab, you actually feint, you feint a sucker right and you power jab in. That is what the 392 does. It pops and it'll surprise you. The amount of power that car has, especially at partial throttle. It doesn't have the knockout power or the knockout torque twist that hook would have, but that jab is just so crisp and it can kind of catch you off guard. I will find myself surprised whenever I drive a Scat Pack. I find myself pleasantly surprised. Another advantage that the Scat Pack or the 392 has over a Hellcat platform is that you can use every one of the horsepowers that you bought. If you take a Scat Pack and put a drag pack on that car, you can dang near dead hook on a dirt road with that combination, and you can have a lot of fun with that car. You can have a lot of fun playing with that car, and you don't find yourself going to the far bottom right-hand side of that speedometer. And I guess the point that I'm making with this is when you have a Scat Pack, you can have more fun with it on the street, provided that you're not concerning yourself with numbers. The Hellcat, on the other hand, it's a lot faster, especially when it comes to modifications. But it's easy to make a Scat Pack fun and fast, whereas the Hellcat, you start tinkering with it and playing with it, you will blow way past whatever the tire is that you're going to run on the car. I mean, most of us run drag radials on the street because it's the only safe tire we can find for it. But the Hellcat, listen, I wouldn't trade my Hellcat for a Scat Pack. Love the Hellcat. But in terms of just being fun on the street, you can get 95% of the performance, as long as we're talking about just playing around 0 to 60, 0 to 100, stuff like that. Things that you do on the street where you're just playing around with it. You can do all of that with a Scat Pack. With the Hellcat, you can't. And since you're so tire limited, you can sometimes find yourself with your Hellcat playing with it in 500 horse mode, which is the big kind of go fish card for the Hellcat, is that you've always got the option to play with it if you want to with the 500 horse mode, where it just reduces everything down to 5 pounds of boost. But again, for something that's going to give you an old school flavor, something that's going to be very quick and sound the part, look the part, and just be a whole lot of fun, it's real difficult to beat the Scat Pack. And that's not just me saying that, that's the marketplace saying that. Look how many Scats and look how many Challengers and Chargers were sold last year, year before last. There's a lot of them. I will say this though, the Hellcat, if you're planning on buying one or the other, well, both of them keep their value really well. The Hellcat, let me tell you one of the biggest problems with the Hellcat. The biggest problem with the Hellcat is that it's too easy to modify. It's too easy to pulley, tune, and get yourself in a situation where, yes, it's faster, but it's not fast enough. And unless you're going to the drag strip, you would never notice that you've put those parts on your car. Because at that point, you're kind of just chasing numbers. Unless you're rolling with a crew and y'all are doing some, playing around on the highway and just roll hits and things like that. That's about the only time you can actually ever run that car at wide open throttle without it breaking the tires loose. Sounds kind of cute. Sounds neat. Oh, it's spinning the tires. Yeah, it's all fine and dandy until the thing wall hunts at 110 miles an hour. So anyway, I'll put it to you like in another way too. I actually really do miss having a 392 car. I'd love to get my hands on a 392 shaker of some kind. They're just neat cars. They're a whole lot of fun, and I don't have any expectations of it. It's just there to entertain me. The Hellcat makes a bit more of a statement, has some more theater with it, but it's tough to say that if you have one, you would want one or should want one more than the other. But I'll tell you that I do miss the 392, even though I have a Hellcat literally sitting right on the other side of that wall. But thank you very much for the contribution, brother. I appreciate it. See, Dads is in saying, hey guys, happy Saturday. VA Rock saying, hey, good evening. What's up, man? Jeff B. Internals don't like boost. Forge it. Well, sort of. And that's what I was talking about earlier. Yeah, throw the kitchen sink at it, but here's the problem. You go forge the internals. What kind of cost does that bring in? So the idea with this is if you're going to put a supercharger on it, put a supercharger on it and just leave it alone at low boost. They can be a lot of fun at low boost, but once you start cracking the thing open, is it really worth it at that point? See, the problem is if you crack the thing open, go forged internals, where do you stop? What would the advice be at that point? Because for me, I would crack the thing open, leave it 11 to 1, tune the thing on corn, and never think about gasoline again. So I'd have an 11 to 1 engine that I could run 14 and a half or 16 pounds of boost through and have something that's making about 900 horsepower to the rear wheels on a Mustang dyno. And that sounds really good. Well, the problem with that is that I'll be into that thing for quite a bit of money. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at my sheet right over here that I'm going to be going off of when I'm talking about stroker motors versus supercharging. Stroker motors, what's the benefit? How much power can you get? All of that. The same way that I was talking about the superchargers or the what is the value proposition in that last video. But to give you an idea, you go 10 over, molar pistons, rods, machine shop, you start getting into everything that you're going to need to do to that block to really make it right. R&R of the block, there's so much more to it. You're going to be spending quite a bit of money. And I know that the argument is, well, what if you do the work yourself? 99.5% of the people out there are not going to do it themselves. So you got to be careful with that. But it's all going to depend on what the fuel quality that you're working with will tolerate. And again, making sure that you're on point with what your ring gaps are. And it's not good enough to just make sure you order that block with the ring gap that you want. In other words, like a short block. You almost have to disassemble the thing and check it to make sure they put the right gap in the rings. It can be a bit of a nightmare, believe me when I tell you. So saying, hey, what's up, B? What's up, so? Nick is in. Good evening, B. What up? Everybody say congratulations to Nick, by the way. I'm very freaking green with envy with Nick right now. Eric's saying, good evening, Professor B. Got the flex. I like it. And he's saying, hey, I met you a while back. You did my ported intake. This is a little off topic, but I bought a Doc differential throttle body about I don't know. They just stopped you right there. Well, good. Awesome. Yeah, you'll like the throttle body. They work nicely. Gary's asking what kind of winter builds do we have going on. I'm just trying to keep my stuff running. Okay, I said, remember, 0 to 60 Scat Pack, 60 to jail, Hellcat. So, and that's one of the things too is the funny thing about the Hellcat, what are the benefits between the two? The one major advantage that the Hellcat has is just how robust that thing is. Hellcats are built like a tank. It's about right. They weigh about as much. But the reality is that they really are built extremely well. And you want to talk about robust. Guys, I've seen Hellcats handle things that they shouldn't have. And I see them dealing with power figures that they really shouldn't have been able to as well. So definitely a good thing. Stuart's asking, is there any advantage the 1320 has over the Hellcat? Not really. Not really. I mean, it would be the same. I mean, Scat Pack 1320. It's all basically going to come out in the wash. I've got a very soft spot in my heart for the 1320, but that's really more sentimental than anything else. There isn't anything powertrain wise that the 1320 has over a normal Scat Pack. You've got some suspension bits that can help keep it more consistent at the drag strip. And you have the ability to order one with a rear seat delete, which I highly recommend. But in terms of actual power plant or anything like that, nah, it's all the same. Just saying he's got a red-eye wide body. Wife has the Scat Pack Charger wide body and find it a blast to drive. Yeah, they're a lot of fun, man. Bruce saying, good evening, Professor B. Hope you and the family has been doing all right with the snow and all. Yeah, we don't get snow down here. It did get cold, though. Actually, it may have snowed a little bit further north. Not down here, though. Cody's asking, what's going on, B? Question of the day, why do American turbo cars make more torque than the others but suffer up top? Well, usually because if you're talking about earlier model turbo cars, they were mostly 2-valve engines, which would kind of lead to that typical power curve of a 2-valve. Oh, Cody's also saying, Scat Pack, you can use the power Hellcats. You can't stretch your legs depending on where you live. That's kind of a good point. So you're saying zero advantage of a 1320 over a Hellcat. Oh, Big K saying zero advantage of a 1320 over a Hellcat. I wouldn't necessarily say zero. Let me tell you where the 1320 does have an advantage. It has an advantage in two different areas. If you want to have a car that's a lot of fun to play with on the street and you want to be able to use all the power that you bought, the 1320 is a real good option for you. Also, if you're going to be taking the car to the drag strip a lot, the 1320 is a real fun platform because it's, number one, extremely consistent, and you can run mid-11s with that thing pretty much like clockwork in good weather. We were able to run 1140s with raised to 1320s. And they will still clock in strong 12-second hits on the street. Hellcat, on the other hand, and this is real subjective, but the issue with the Hellcat is if you have a bone stock Hellcat, you'll find yourself a little bit frustrated with it unless you're running drag radials all the time with that car. The reason why I say that is because they're harder to launch on the street because they are making more power, but they don't necessarily feel a lot faster unless you are really into the throttle. So for kicking around town, 1320 can be a little bit more spirited. It's going to have about 130 less pounds hanging over the front axles, so at least there's that. You really have a tendency to feel the weight with a Hellcat, where you don't really feel it as much because it's not there with any of the Scat Pack variants. So you want to go real fast, you got to start defining what real fast is. The reason why I say that is because all of these cars are capable, the new ones are, capable on a drag pack, wheel and tire combination. They're all at sea level able to go mid-11s. And they will do that on the street as well. I used to go sniping after Hellcats with my SRT. It's kind of funny, actually. But the reality is they would always gun me down. But they'd have hell in the process doing it, and that was always a fun thing for me. So if it's in the budget, here's the key thing though. If it's in the budget to get a Hellcat, one of the key advantages of Hellcat, resale value. It'll always be a Hellcat, which means it'll always be, for many people, more desirable than anything powered with a 392. That's just the way that it works out in terms of resale value. So there's at least that to consider if you're thinking about buying one new. Chuck's asking, he's seen a lot of videos on YouTube about a twin turbo inline six replacing the hemis is fake news. So that engine was originally being talked about for a long time to replace the Hemi in trucks. And the reason why it was starting to get some traction at one point, and the reason why I started talking about it for the LX platform is, well, if it's taking the place of the Hemi in the trucks, could it be taking the place of the Hemi in the cars? I don't think that engine will actually fit packaging wise in an LX platform. It might, you can always re-engineer it, but we don't really know what the next platform is going to look like. And so if it did take the place of any of the V8 combinations, whether it's the 5.7, 6.4, or just instead of having two V8s, you have one inline six, is it a bad thing? Well, depends on how you look at it. If you're a big fan of naturally aspirated V8s, then yeah, it's going to be a bit of a problem. Myself, I am a huge inline six fan. So for me, it's kind of cool. Might be kind of neat to have a bunch of boosted from the factory engines running around. And so you lose a little bit of that V8 swagger. Yeah, but you get all this inline six turbo goodness that, let's be honest, if they build that inline six anywhere nearly as robustly as they did the Hellcat combinations, could you imagine? I mean, power is going to be super easy, and packaging is a whole lot easier too, which makes maintenance and upkeep and everything else that much easier. So it's not fake news unless it's being sold to you as fact. It's speculation, and it's news because the engine technically does exist. At least it's under development. Hang on just a second. So there is that. I would like to see a V8 still be available, which I believe that they would, at least in what anybody would consider to be a legacy platform, anything that would use a V8, like an LX legacy type platform, which, who knows, that still may be in the cards. Oh, Devin's talking about the main reason for the new car, the tiny turbos spooling up quick. Yeah, you know, the fun thing about that is you can always replace them. Oh, Devin's talking about the V-dub. Yeah, V-dub stuff you can make go pretty quick. If you're not familiar with it, it's pretty much C-spot run to get a GTI in the mid to low 12s. Eric saying, I enjoyed your video early in the week. I was wanting a Procharger, but definitely been thinking more about the positive displacement blower for my 5.7. Which kit would be your top pick? It'd be a toss-up between the Whipple and the E-Force. You really can't go wrong either way. And in terms of kits, those are going to be the most comprehensive. And what you're going to want to do is get with somebody that can walk you through the process, get you everything that you need. Fuel system components, basically soup to nuts, all the parts that you're going to need for this install. I would recommend pinning the crank. There's a lot of things that I would suggest while you're going down this path. But it ain't going to be cheap, but it is going to be entertaining, I can tell you that. I have driven 5.7 E-Force cars, and they are a lot of fun to drive. It's kind of like driving a car with a 392 that just happens to be making more torque, if you can imagine that, down low and through the mid-range, lower mid-range. One question that I get, a lot of people say, well, why don't you just put a Hellcat supercharger on a 5.7, or why don't you, for a 6.4 or whatever? There's some issues with that. There are adapters that you can buy, and technically, yes, you can put that supercharger on those cars. The issue that I have is when you try to start working with the bypass that comes with those IHI superchargers, they're electronic bypass. So you need to have that understanding that, yeah, even though the deal that you get might be better on an IHI, which is what comes on the Hellcats, phenomenal supercharger, but that is an OE designed unit that has in its operating system for the cars, or for anything that has that to begin with, provisions to make that bypass work for that combination. I just don't recommend it. It's a pain in the ass. Get something that's designed to work with your combination, something with a mechanical bypass like the E-Force or the Whip, and that has everything basically already laid out for you. It'll make the installation process more fun. If you're doing it yourself, it'll make the installation process a lot easier for a shop. If the shop is doing it, it'll make it a fun build as opposed to something that you wish you never got in the middle of to begin with. Just remember that you could literally, in some cases, be stepping over dollars to collect dimes. In other words, you're trying to save money in one area, but you're going to end up hemorrhaging money somewhere else trying to make it work. So just remember that is and can be a very real thing. Gary, thank you very much, man. Wow, that's awesome. I appreciate that, bud. Asking, I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. Which oil pump is best for 6.4 when doing a rebuild, stock, Hellcat, or milling? So I believe the Hellcat will bolt up to it. I think the newer oil pumps may have a higher volume than the older ones do. I would need to get this verified, but if there is a question between those, check with milling and find out if it is a high volume pump, and basically what is the oil pressure going to be at idle. The reason why I say that, and the reason why I am thinking that the newer cars, depending on where this breakover point is, primarily with the 5.7s, from what I've seen, my work truck, which is a 5.7, at idle has basically the same oil pressure that my Hellcat does, roughly 44, 47 PSI when the oil is nice and hot. And this is with a 20 weight oil. Not that it really matters, but the reality is that it's got a significantly higher oil pressure than my old truck did. So check to see if the milling is going to be a high volume pump. I believe that it is. The Hellcat, the Hellcat may bolt up to the 6.4. I don't think it'll bolt up to the 5.7. I think it's a spacing issue. So I would probably go aftermarket with that. And again, the peak oil pressure that you'll see, that spring will pop. Typically, it'll crack open the bypass will at 65 PSI. And the idea with these pumps is that it's either got a physically larger rotor inside of it, or it's designed in a way to where it just has more actual pressure at idle. So again, my truck, the way that it sits, and this is something that I noticed, and I put this out to folks too, going, hey, listen, this is stuff that just doesn't really come on my radar too often, but lately it has, and I've been asking quite a few guys, fire up the 392 and see what oil pressure is when it warms up for the later model cars, like 19, 20, and 21 up. Check that stat and see if that is the case with those cars too. My 392 at idle had low oil pressure. It always did. It was like 28 to 32 PSI. It wasn't really a problem. Say you got into the throttle, it would go right up to 45, 55 PSI. Again, my old work truck had the same issue, or I shouldn't say issue, it just had the same type of oil pump in it, where the Hellcat just doesn't. It's got that physically larger, it's actually physically longer, bigger rotor in it. And again, that truck and my Hellcat at full operating temperature at idle are both identical at 43 to 44 psi as opposed to 33 psi or 28 psi. Second one, are ported heads really needed for a mild cam and header NA build? No, not at all. In fact, I've struggled to understand the idea behind ported heads for one of these modern Eagle Gen 3s. They flow 340 CFM from the factory. There's literally not another 2-valve head that flows more than those heads unless it is an LS7 head. I don't know of any other head that flows as much as those do, and because of that, porting them isn't really going to gain you anything. The main thing at that point is just going to make sure that you've got a cam that's got fast ramps and you've got a lot of spring pressure. I always recommend roughly 410 open and about 135, 140 closed seat pressure. And last, which push rod is best? Thinking weight and diameter. I know some guys go with the 3/8 inch push rods. My thing, it's really not a diameter thing, it's a thickness thing. So I like to see 080 wall thickness. The 120s, you don't really need to go that heavy with them. Some guys do. Just remember though that you've got, and let me tell you why I'm not a big fan of the 120s. So the Hemi has very heavy valve, and we're talking intake side, big valve, funky geometry. You've got a real odd rocker scenario. It's a shaft mounted rocker, but it's shaft mounted with no bearings. It's just a slip shaft, rocker just slides on the shaft. And that's not the best in the world in terms of being just easy to deal with from a valve train stability issue or standpoint. You've got, I wouldn't say heavy, well, they're roller lifters, not necessarily light. The point of this is any extra weight that you're throwing at these cars is going to potentially limit their ability to handle higher RPM. Ideally, with a cam with a stock intake, talking about the 6.4s, you're going to want to run it up to around 64, 6600 RPM, depending on the cam. It just depends on how aggressive you went with it. In that case, stand key tie bars and collars would be recommended. But the push rods, I would say 080 wall thickness would be the ones that you would want to go with. I used to have this part number memorized too. It's an MMX push rod that I used to order a lot of. Anyway, it was the 080 wall thickness. And the only time I would ever look into the 120s is if I was putting something together that was pretty nasty. But for the most part, it's about 7,000 RPM, 7,200 RPM with PSI 15, 16 springs set up at about 140 PSI-ish and about 410-ish open pressure. You're going to be good with that. Again, you start to question at that point, rockers could potentially create an issue for you. If you're not running the right spring, you start to get some, just because, where's my damn papers at? Anyway, the way that rocker is, if you get any deflection going on in there, you can pop a rocker. But doesn't happen a lot, but I have seen it or at least heard of it a couple of times. So, damn, I wish I could remember that part number too. Because again, I used to order it about 2 or 3 times a month. So hopefully that answers the question. It's really a wall thickness thing, not an actual diameter thing. Let's see. And really, if you're asking about the oil pumps, it'd be tough to go against melling. But I would really want to find out what that melling is going to offer at idle for oil pressure. But thank you very much, man. I appreciate that, Gary. Hopefully that answers the question. Let me see if you got any follow-ups there. Oh, Gary's saying the car is a 2020. They do offer regular and a high volume. Always go the high volume. It doesn't cost anything. Oh, so one of the things to remember, Gary, is that you may have heard somebody say, well, the high volume pump is going to cost you power. It does not cost you power at all. And what it'll do is it'll assure that you have good oil pressure at idle. All of the high volume oil pumps will idle around 43, 46 PSI. What you don't want to do is you need that for these Gen 3 Hemis. I am convinced that the move to the higher volume pump that like I have in my truck is what has saved, at least significantly reduced the number of issues with camshafts and lifters failing. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to get a high pressure oil pump. Number one, it's just not really needed. And the issue there is that it's one thing if it's high pressure and high volume, but most of the time it's just a regular pump. And what they've done is they've just ramped up the spring pressure to where it doesn't go into bypass until a later PSI. You don't really need it. 65 PSI is going to be fine. 70 PSI is going to be fine from the stock pumps. But as long as there is a high volume option, always go with that high volume with these Gen 3s. It's real cheap insurance. Let's see. Oh, Gary's saying, thanks again. I'll be running a cam for you with a Stanky guide, supported intake, and 85 millimeter throttle body, 15, 16 springs. Thanks for the info. Absolutely, my friend. Yeah, and again, you know, there's the good thing about the Gen 3, especially the 392, it's got a real sweet spot. And that is a cam. You've got a Goldilocks of 392. A lot of it has to do with cam selection. One of the biggest issues, I know it's supposed to be about supercharging, but one of the biggest issues with cams back in the day for the Gen 3s is they all had real wide lobe separation angles for an aftermarket camshaft. And they looked a lot like what you would have seen early on for camshafts for LS engines. And it was one of these things, it's kind of an old school way of thinking. What it was is it was okay. The idea with a wide lobe separation angle is that you're relying on the intake port to be a lot more active. And what that means is just that for the amount of degrees that the piston is coming down on the intake stroke, it's killing overlap between the two valves and just having the primary charge coming through the intake runner. There's always going to be some amount of overlap. The wider the lobe separation angle is, the earlier the exhaust valve closes, and therefore your intake runner, so to speak, is just more active. That's cool and all. The only problem is that it can make the car feel a bit sluggish at the expense of building power further out. It basically takes a power curve and it just makes it flat. And a flat power curve gives a pretty flat driving experience. So cams like the old Comp 270, Comp 274 had real wide lobe separation angles, and they were dogs down low, and then they would start making power, decent power up top, but they just weren't all that great. I'll put it to you like this. Like if you're choosing a cam for a supercharger, since we're talking superchargers, although not perfectly ideal, it ain't that far from it. A cam that does not suck with positive displacement superchargers is the Comp 274. Actually, it's pretty good. But that's that's the way to go, though. Yeah, Stanky tie bars and collars, ported intake, 85 millimeter throttle body, 15/16 springs, which are the only ones I'll sign off on. And that is the best way to go. But thank you, brother. I appreciate that, man. I really do. Thank you very, very much, my friend. Very generous of you. Let me get back up here. Hang on. Jeff saying V8 for him all the way. Devin saying an i6 turbo would be insane. Seriously, do you know why the i6 configuration is not popular anymore? It's arguably the best. One of the reasons why the inline six didn't garner a whole lot of further development is because of packaging. The V6 is just a lot easier to package. It is more compact, primarily for front drive applications. So you could have a V6 that could be transversely mounted to run a front wheel drive car, which could also power a transaxle to run all wheel drive configuration. So the V6 is a little bit more, I guess you could call it versatile. I mean, you can kind of, it's a stretch, but it is more versatile in that respect. And again, it's all about packaging. But the inline stuff, with modern metallurgy and the fact that the modern inline sixes, they're really only about, like you can see what I'm doing, they're only about that long. A lot of people were worried about flexing and things like that. It's not really an issue. I mean, we've seen Supras and Barras and all the rest of the nasty inline six combinations making huge power and spin into whatever RPM you want them to. It doesn't matter. But that's primarily the reason why, though, is that it has a lot to do with packaging, and the front wheel drive configuration just doesn't really sit well. It's kind of hard to transversely mount an inline six and have a transmission in there as well. Stuart's asking about a 572 block into a modern Challenger. Would that work? Man, you sink enough money into these things, sure, you could get one to fit, but it probably wouldn't do a whole lot of good. I mean, a 572, the problem is what would be the purpose of it when you can go eights with a hellcat combination? The 572 just be more show and tell at the local drive-in. But it can be done, but it ain't easy. The funny thing about the LX platform, just as a side note, it's actually the engine compartment is a lot smaller than you might think. And Sovereign's saying, hey, make some so, Sovereign. Cody's saying, consider the Challenger started life as an inline six. I wouldn't be surprised. Good point. She's saying, what's stronger pound for pound, trans only? Scat Pack A8 or Scat Pack M6? I'll put it to you like this. They're both really stout. I would say that the 6-speed is probably more stout, though, than the HP 70. Sovereign saying, I didn't win the Dodge 25-8. No hell-raising Scat Pack. Yeah, I didn't win either. But again, Gary, thank you very much, bud. Appreciate that. Very generous of you. Chet's asking, hey, B, do you know if the 2022 Red Eye Charger comes with a 262 or 309? I believe they are all 262 cars. Jeff's asking, what's the difference between HP90 and HP95 trans? The HP90 or the HP95 is dedicated to the Trackhawks, if memory serves me correctly. The HP95 or the HP90 is Red Eye, Demon, pretty much everything. There isn't I think the difference between that 90 and the 95 is the ability to have the transfer case that the Jeep has. Oh, Cody's saying once the 5.7 gets unrestricted, it's a whole different car. Yeah, it is. Big time. HU saying, I don't know about other kits when it comes to installation. The Procharger kit is probably the easiest to install. The directions are like following a cookbook recipe. Yeah, they're actually really good instructions on the Procharger. Someone saying, dang bots, I know. Gary's, we're talking about old pumps. They do offer that high volume. Go with the high volume for sure. Cody's saying, can't go wrong with the old school methods. Very true. Cody's asking if I think Dodge will ever make a dual overhead cam V8. I don't know, man. It's kind of hard to see Dodge going down that path. It doesn't really, it might fit in with their marketing. It's more about packaging than anything else. So, I mean, I don't necessarily think they would never do it, but I think that you'll see Dodge doing something like an inline six with turbos before you see them put 4-cam V8s in a car. If they are going to walk kind of in lockstep with one of the things that made Dodge cool, and that was that when front-wheel drive looked like that's the way things were going to go, when the whole muscle car thing ran its course and the 80s did what they did. You know, early in the 80s, I should say, or the 70s did what they did. Early in the 80s, you had cars like the Omni GLH, you had the Daytona, Shelby Daytona, you had cars like the Conquest. Starion would be the Mitsubishi version of that. Awesome freaking car, by the way, way ahead of its time. The Dodge 600, you had really neat, different, and interesting four-cylinder turbo cars that were floating around out there. And guys were making them really, really fast. And back in those days, an 11-second car was unheard of unless you drug it in on a trailer. And there were guys that were running some of those cars deep into the 12s and into the 11s as front-wheel drive hot rods. So, I mean, it was not uncommon to see 11-second Daytonas going down the track, front-wheel drive. So they've been on the cutting edge of what is to come for a long time. I'll take this a little bit further too. Had the pony cars gone the way that a lot of people thought that they were going to go, and the way that the manufacturers actually thought that they were going to go, Dodge was actually sitting in the perfect position to take over front-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, and inline four, and what would probably end up being inline six, V6 turbos also, dominance. It's just, it ended up not going that route. We ended up with cars after the Fox Body Mustang, for example, was supposed to be the last of the rear-wheel drive Mustangs, and the Probe GT was going to be the new Mustang. Camaro could have conceivably gone that way as well. And here was Dodge with this offering of these new performance cars with a new way of doing things that was actually really good. And I mean, look no further than the SRT4. And this is a car that at one point in time you could you still can accidentally build an 11-second SRT4. So, do I see him building a 4-cam V8? Nah, not really. I can see him going ham, though, with inline six turbos and seeing guys building 1,300 horsepower inline six engine combinations and going nuts with those things. So, would I be involved with that? Probably so, because that would be kind of right up my alley. Gary's saying, thanks for the heads info. Yes, I keep telling people that it's too much for an Apache head or stock or mild build. You know, my thing is this. The newer cars are just that much better. And yes, you can take any of the older stuff pretty far. They're a lot of fun. They're a lot more old school-ish. But there's if you're trying to put a 6.1 up against a 6.4, you've got an uphill battle with a 6.1. They do react better to long tube headers because they've got a tighter lobe separation angle. They are basically the Dodge LS, if you will. The problem is that, and in a lot of ways, by the way, the 5.7 is the same way because it doesn't have a short, long runner, variable runner intake. But if you're looking to make power, man, just look no further than your local 6.4 or your closest 6.4, and that's going to be the route that you're really going to want to take. Arthur saying, the legend, the myth, B. Mason. What's up, Arthur? Oh, Greg saying, I thought my Hellcat was sluggish until I did the HHP Stage 2 and the Power Commander, and my Hellcat is a launch animal. It makes stock red eye seem real sluggish. They're easy to get there, for sure. But I can tell you that a lot of guys that bought Hellcats but didn't drive them first. A lot of the dealers wouldn't let you drive them, still won't let you drive them for a lot of good reasons. But they were noticing that the car on tip-in, it didn't feel as strong as what they thought it would or thought it should. And these are guys that are coming from an era where 700 horsepower was scary fast. And the weird thing about a Hellcat is that it's not scary fast until you realize how fast you're going. They're extremely smooth. More to the point, they're extremely stable. They come from their DNA is rooted in Mercedes-Benz, in cars that were built to run on the Autobahn at 130, 140 miles an hour indefinitely. Incredibly stable. So the weird thing about it is that you go, man, this car I just don't feel like it's going that fast, but you're finding yourself cruising at 90, 95 miles an hour and not really realizing it. So anyway, just a bit of an observation when it comes to those things. So we're saying Hemi pushrod is probably the last electric is taking over. Talking about the V8s. Yeah, maybe. So we're saying just more PSI. More PSI is good. And Gary, thanks again, buddy. I appreciate it. Give the guys a shout over at Dr. Diff. They'll get you hooked up with that cam. Albert saying turbo or supercharge. So this is going to be a chat that I'm going to talk a little bit about in the upcoming video where I talk about strokers, and I'll probably touch on turbos at some point. Here's the thing. Turbos for Gen 3 Hemi. Kind of an interesting proposition there. Hellion is the only turbo kit that I would look at. The problem with the Hellion kit, and by the way, turbos are cheat codes. Don't get it twisted. Turbos will always make more power, pound for boost, 4 pound of boost, than any supercharger out there. It's an efficiency thing. It's a parasitic loss thing. They have far less, although not a zero, but it is less parasitic loss than centrifugal superchargers and significantly less than a positive displacement supercharger. But the issue with turbocharging is cost and complexity of the kit. So Hellion makes a badass kit for the modern Hemis. But the problem is that badass kit that Hellion makes is checking in at around $15,000 to $17,000. And it's a great looking kit. I've seen one in person. I've seen one on a car. They will make crazy power. If your goal is to put down 1,200 horsepower to the rear wheels and have something that will scare the hell out of pretty much anything you roll up on the highway, probably going to have to go with that kit. The problem is that it costs $15,000 to $17,000. Now, that's not to say that, you're still going to have to pay money for a blower kit, but the reality is that it's about twice as expensive as the blower kit itself. Plus, the install is going to be significantly more in depth. It's a shake your head type of thing, but the Hellion kit's the way to go. If it's my car, I'm going to go with something that I know that I can install easily, get a lot of bang for the buck, but be able to flip if I need to. Selling a Hellion turbo kit is going to be a rough proposition. So, and for the reasons that I just talked about, they're crazy expensive and they're a pain in the ass to install. Plus, are you getting all the parts to the kit? But again, if you want to make the most outright power, that's the way that you go. So, just depends on your budget. And I would say that if budget is not an option, you go the turbo route every time. Oh, Cody's hanging out with Sovereigns. It sucks about the 4-cam V8. Yeah, I know. And torque would be great. Top end would be great too. Chances are they build a big engine. The problem with building a big 4-cam engine is that you got to put it in something. And it's got to have, look how big the Coyote engine is. And one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that if you put a Coyote next to a 392, it makes a 392 look small. If you put a Coyote next to an LS variant, the LS variant looks practically minuscule compared to that Coyote. And the reason for that is the cylinder head on a Coyote. You may not realize this. Cylinder head on a Coyote is about this freaking tall, and it's about that wide. They're humongous. They flow like you wouldn't believe. But the big deal is just how much further out that engine is, how much wider of a V it is. I did a video, and they're not necessarily heavy, but they're just bulky as hell. I did a video, it's been forever ago, where I compare horsepower per weight. And it turned out, I want to say the 392 won compared to the Coyote at the time, but you had to infinitely, they were identical down to just the atomic scale. I think I had to bring it out 5 places or something like that. I forget, it's an old video. But anyway, I got curious about that because it's an aviation standard. It's how many horsepower per pound, or rather how many pounds per horsepower did the engine have? The idea was to have 1 horsepower per pound of actual engine. That was the idea. I think Lycoming was the first engine manufacturer to do it. It's a single stage supercharger inverted V8, I think. Anyway, here comes all the useless information, right? Gary's saying, big thanks. That was my final questions for closing out my build. Oh, sorry, guys. Did not mean to hijack the chat. You can hijack the chat anytime you want. You can do stuff like that. But it's all really good questions, and they're all relevant. And look, the idea is when you are putting together a combination, make sure you have a good idea as far as what you want that combination to act like. And as far as, just working knowledge of how these cams work, give the team over at Dr. Differential and Speed a shout. We can absolutely walk you through what the cars are like to drive. He's got some videos as far as what they sound like. And, there's some definite things to consider when you're putting cams together. I always say with these hemis, you err on the side of small and don't worry about what the thing sounds like. My babyest cam that I have will damn near run 10s in a 4,600 pound Charger. So when it's tuned right and everything's right with the world, those things are really good. So anyway, hopefully that helps. And again, thank you very much, buddy. Oh, Cody's hanging out with Sovereign, saying dual overhead cam works better at higher numbers, only if it's set up to work better at higher numbers. Remember, it's all about cam, it's all about head flow. The idea was some, like my old Sequoia 4-cam or 4-valve truck. The idea with that and the Tundras is to have an extremely long and extremely flat torque curve, which you can do with those types of engines too. Ben's asking, just wonder if there's any possibility of emptying the oil pan at high RPM using a high volume pump instead of a high pressure pump. The high volume pump will still be the same volume. It's just that it has a higher volume at idle. So technically speaking, the pump that's in the car right now from the factory, by that standard, would be a high volume pump. You would just have to change the spring, and you would get the higher volume at idle, or rather it depends on how it's set up, but you would just, when the bypass cracks, it's, you're not going to be forcing anything more than 65 PSI through the thing to begin with. Higher pressure can actually cause that to happen though, because you're allowing the pump to push more volume, even though it's volume is one thing, but we're trying to push pressure through the system, which shoots oil up into the valve covers. Modern engines, just so you know, any of these V8 Gen 3 configuration, whether it's Apache or Eagle, can handle 65 PSI at 7,200 RPM without any issues. Again, just make sure you've got at least 6 or 7 quarts in your oil pan and you'll be just fine. I think the minimum you would want to have is 6 in that pan though. So just know that coming into it. But no, it's not like the old 2JZ where you literally had to drill out the cylinder head down into the block to make sure you had enough adequate oil return. That was a 2JZ. Kind of a fun fact a lot of people don't know about 2JZs. You spin bearings all the time because they would flash over so quickly, and they would just literally lift every amount of oil they had in the pan and have it on top of the cylinder head. So, but no, you're in good shape with that. We buzz these things to 65, 6,800 RPM. A lot of guys have spun them to 72, 7,400 RPM with no issues whatsoever, and no provisions and no for drill or drain backs through drilling anything out or anything like that. Gary says took his driving test in a 96 i6 Ford F-150 5-speed. So, funny story about that exact truck. My stepdad had one with a 5-speed manual as a work truck for a small amount of time. I freaking loved that truck. I would find excuses to drive that thing. And that was, God, I couldn't have been more than 15 years old. That was one of the, no, I was about 16 years old. That was one of the most fun trucks, because you could, on oil field roads, you could hang that thing sideways for days. And it just, I don't know. I've got to think, so a lot of guys don't like the way inline sixes sound. I happen to love the way inline sixes sound because they always sound like they're screaming, even if you're only turning 3,000 RPM. Anyway, fun fact, it was red, by the way. Loved that truck. I kind of wish I kind of wish I would have been able to get my hands on that truck. By the way, that 300 cubic inch inline six made a lot of torque, and some people would argue that it made more torque than the 5-liter V8. It was on par with it for sure, no doubt about it. And a lot of guys hop those things up too. Cody's asking about tips to reduce heat soak. EcoBoost love to heat soak pretty quickly. So is there any way to reduce it? Not so sure about the EcoBoost stuff. With our cars, they're actually not bad in terms of heat soak. I can tell you that the fact that the NA stuff all has polymer manifolds makes life real nice, just in terms of the way that they don't retain heat in a polymer manifold. The Hellcats, man, they gonna get hot So just know that coming into it. Just keep keep plenty of, some guys like to ice down the supercharger or ice down intakes and say, keep plenty of ice on hand. No, you don't have to do that. It's just a function of making a bunch of power, man. There's really not a whole lot that you can do with those combinations. Sovereign's hanging out with Cody. Yeah, the 4Cam in the Coyotes just makes a ton of power on the big end. It's in a lighter weight combination, and I mean, it just makes fantastic power up top. It's never going to have the torque of the bigger engine because displacement makes torque. So it doesn't matter how you would. I mean, believe me when I tell you, they've got that engine cam timed to make as much torque as it possibly can throughout the entire rev range. So it's just a question of engine size at that point. Kobe's in saying, what's up, man? The Blues are saying, hey, Broad Canada guy checking in. Just thought I would stop by and say, hey, what's up, man? Good to see you. Kobe's asking, what are you sipping on today? Actually, I need to get another one. We're doing Purple Powerade up in here. Hang on. Get back. Yeah, we're doing Purple Powerade. Weapon of choice this evening. Good stuff. So we're saying Dodge Daytona. Yep, the LeBaron is in. LeBaron's a pretty dope car. Oh, Cody's saying Dodge shouldn't have given up on the SRT4 name. They had their fair share of problems, but I think they could improve upon them and be more badass. I don't know. I always love those things. Sommer's bringing in the Wraith. Cody's hanging out with Sovereign. Let's see. HU saying, do you think Mopar will come out with a small displacement V8? Easy to package and can be made with turbos or as hybrids or both. The Mopar needs the muscle car sound, and the 6 can't do that. And Sovereign saying yes. Man, look, we'll see. It depends on which way they decide to go. It depends on what build or design philosophy they want to roll with. And to be honest with you, it's hard to pick a favorite in this in terms of, do you go with a 4Cam V8 in, small like the Mustang? But here's the thing: if you cannot be more Mustang than the Mustang. Look at what happened with Chevrolet. An amazing engine with the LT variant or the LS variant, but it can never out Mustang the Mustang, which is why it never really caught on with some folks. Listen, those in the know you can get a lot of power out of them, but you're going to have to paper up. And, at that point, a lot of guys just don't want to go through the headaches or the hassle. But the reality is you're not going to out Mustang the Mustang. And the cool thing about the 392 is that it offers up a completely different driving experience than the 5-liter. You can have both of them in your garage and have a unique driving experience one from the next. And this is where the inline 6 comes into play. You can still do that with an inline 6 turbo versus the Coyote. And I always use the Coyote as kind of a benchmark for high winding V8. Coolness, what do you compare that to? Well, if you don't have another V8 to compare it to from a performance standpoint, that inline 6 would be sweet. Maybe it has about the same torque, but it has a big rush through the mid-range. I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can play this out. But I can tell you that it would be a lot of fun either way. And when I tell you that the aftermarket would swarm an inline 6, they would swarm that inline 6 the way that they swarm the Coyote platform, and that's what would make it a lot of fun. Oh, Cody's saying, if the i6 comes twin turbo, then they just got to go single turbo and already get a blueprint for a 1,000 horsepower car. I mean, it's all there for you to do. Let's see. Chuck's asking, what makes the M5 so competitive? Power to weight ratio or the twin turbo V8? Well, it's power to weight ratio given to you by the twin turbo V8. So we're saying, just look at the i6 Cummins for sure. So saying the old Slant 6 used to be super fun until I got a hold of a 440 big block. Staying with the V8 since the late 70s, unless a daily can't be feeding that every day for sure on that. Sovereign saying he thinks superchargers work great for push rods, turbos for dual overhead cam. You know, turbo, so here's the thing with turbos, it's all about packaging. They all work great. They all will do the exact same thing to each engine. The big difference here is going to come with packaging. And the dual overhead cam combination does really well with turbos because you have such good exhaust flow typically. The flow in and the flow out is typically better into the combustion chamber with a 4-valve head. They just simply flow more without really even trying than even performance engineered 2-valve heads. So yeah, they're great all the way across. We're going to react the same way with boost. Boost is boost. Doesn't matter. The engine doesn't know where it's coming from. But dual overhead cam usually means smaller engine, unless we're talking about the Coyote. Dual overhead typically means smaller engine, and it also typically means, potentially in some cases, easier packaging. Efficiency really comes to mind. And if you want something that is compact, efficient, lots of power to weight, you build a small dual overhead cam V8, hang a couple of turbos off of it, and now you're really onto something. It's what Lotus used to do. Let's see. So I was saying, the dual overhead cams are more complex. Yeah, they would be considered more complex. So I'm saying, so for a shorter stroke, the push rod produces greater torque than the larger dual overhead cam. So for a shorter stroke, no. So I think you're looking for a generalization, and you really can't. I mean, look at the Tundra engine. It's a 4-valve engine, and it's known for making torque. A shorter stroke is just going to mean a lesser signal on the intake runner. So depending on cam, there's lots of things that come into play, cam profiles, things like that. I think what you're looking for is a generalization. So in general, and a 2-valve is going to make more bottom end power because you'll have more velocity coming through the intake port than you will for a 4-valve. It's one of the reasons why you would have delete, like IMRC delete on the Mustangs back in the day, would block off one of the runners for the intake run, for the 4-cam engine, just letting it breathe basically through one valve. The idea was that you had more velocity coming through that valve, in essence turning it into a 3-valve engine. But you would have more velocity coming through that valve, have better cylinder fill. That was the thought process. I know a lot of people just deleted it and didn't notice any real difference. But when you're talking about just power production, torque production, that is kind of where I think that's where you're going with that. And then in that same configuration, the 4-valve would pick up at about mid-range and just, have a higher power production after that, all things being equal, because yes, the 4-valve head will flow more, but again, the velocity will be less, so that inlet air charge won't be as great with the 4-valve head as it will be with the 2-valve. HU saying that, well, I don't know if I agree with this, HU. Saying the turbo makes it a torque monster. Here's the thing. It's not necessarily harder on drivetrain than a positive displacement supercharger, because that's torque literally right now at zero inertia, or at maximum inertia at zero speed. You can make the argument that a positive displacement supercharger is the hardest on drivetrain components because the car is at a dead stop. Think of it like it's at a drag strip. You're on a slick, wide open throttle. You get all of this boost right now out of a positive displacement supercharger, and it's trying to launch this thing forward. The turbos have to have some level or some RPM running to get them going. So if you just sit the thing at, say, 1500 RPM and hit the throttle, the engine will rev, then the boost comes in. So it's actually softer on drivetrain components, with the centrifugal superchargers being the easiest on them because, I mean, unless you're launching the thing off of a two-step, if you're just foot braking it, the supercharger, the centrifugal supercharger is just going to take that much longer to create boost. Oh, yeah, Hemi Head's talking about the RX-9 concept. Yeah, we'll see how far they take that. But the Z looks good. If they go with the new bumper on the Z, that is going to be sick. I mean, sick to death, man. That thing looks good if they're going to be going with that new front bumper. I'm not, God, I hate to say this, I'm not a fan of the 400, the way that it looks with the 370Z-ish looking front bumper. It looks like a 370Z went to a plastic surgeon and got a facelift. It just doesn't look good. Now with the new bumper, the one that looks like a 240Z front bumper, oh shit, that looks good. So yeah, that's definitely got my vote. Gary said, oh, he's going to give Dr. Diff a shout. Working with him on my goals and decided on the high roller cam. I care about power, function, not sound. High roller sounds nasty. And that's going to be, it'll be making a ton of power for sure. Oh, Sovereign saying he also thinks the pump was the issue. That's what I've been saying for forever. When I had my 392, I was even suspect of it because I was looking at it thinking, this seems a little bit low, like it doesn't seem properly high. But I mean, you know, what do I know? I'm just a dude looking at, engine stuff all the time. But I had questioned that at one point, and the fact that it was that low with such a thick oil, basically a 40 weight oil at normal oil temps, just seemed kind of weird, having high 20, low 30 PSI at that RPM. So anyway, yeah, I've been thinking it was, just soft oil pressure, and that the Gen 3 by design needed something that was going to make a minimum of like 35 or 38 PSI at idle. Chuck's saying gas is $4 a gallon here in Vermont, so it's $65 to fill the RT. I feel your pain. Sovereign, yes, F-150s are one of the most reliable trucks by Ford. That's why it's the top seller. Chuck saying, I miss the 80s gas prices. Yeah, who doesn't? That's what Sovereign's saying. Sovereign Sal's about to say the exact same thing. Sovereign said, it's not bad here in California. It's $430. Or $430 is considered cheap for 87. Yeah, it's crazy. Damn, Sovereign's got himself an E350. Oh, dude, have I got stories about E350s. The following year that took 87 gas, now it's 89 for the newer models in synthetic oil. Awesome car. Love those things. They will outlive and outlast. Oh my God, I've seen ES350s that had been through the engine equivalent of a torture chamber and come out the other side with no issues. ES350 in the house. Hang on. Oh, HU's talking about EcoBoost stuff. Let's see. It ain't no Challenger. Oh, Chuck's Sovereign saying, hanging out with Chuck. He inherited it from his grandmother who passed away. Got it at 35, now it hit 80. Had the chance to trade it for a 2010 RT Chalet. Oh, Cody's talking about Lotus. Yeah, those are the later cars. I'm talking about the earlier Esprit turbos. Oh, Chuck's talking about, yeah, sentimental value. Dude, the ES is a freaking cool ass car. Oh, Sovereign saying, thanks for clearing that. Cool. Oh, Cody's hanging out with HU. Let's see. Chuck saying, thanks for asking my questions. Absolutely, brother. Let's see. Big John saying, to my 392 owners, quit roll racing that 10-speed Mustang. Please learn how to launch your cars from a dig before going racing. Look, man, it's true. It's, you can't, you got to pick your battles. Look, guys, I will say this. A lot of guys go, well, I don't want to get smoked by a 5.0. At the drag strip, my SRT on a drag pack, I may have lost one race to an NA 5-liter Mustang. This is a street NA 5.0 Mustang. I'm not talking about stripped down, grudge racer looking, ain't nothing left of the car but the rims type of a car. I'm talking about legit ass NA Mustang at the drag strip from a dig. I may have lost one race to one of those cars because I would get out on them so hard that they didn't have enough real estate to reel me in. I'm not going to say they weren't reeling me in, because they were. That car would trap 116, 117 pretty easily. So it's not like the car was slow, but the same would play out on the street, because I would, roll that thing with a drag pack or ET Street SS's. And it ran great. But the idea is, they both have their strengths. They both offer completely different driving experiences. But the Dodge ain't a roll race car. Look, it is built like a tank. It's got the aerodynamic coefficient of drag of your average barn. It's heavy, not that it matters because you're not really overcoming inertia, but you kind of are. And you're lacking a very aggressive fifth gear that the Mustang has, which all of that, when you put it all together, kind of spells curtains for the 392 cars. But put them in their element, it's a completely different story. Not to mention, it's completely different based on how they're tuned and where they make power. Tobias asking, 6.4 Jeep with 5-speed reliability. Your Vincer's so informative. Thank you. Got the flex. I like it. They're real reliable. I don't know of many that have had any issues with those 5 speeds, to be honest with you. I never saw any anyway. Blues are saying he's got an oil pressure light on and off with his 0457 Ram. Going to replace the sensor and see if that does anything. Would like to also put a mechanical gauge in it. Probably need to figure out what the deal is going on with that. Yeah, don't just tear the dash off and remove the light, though. You really do need to find out what's causing that. But no, replace the sensor, see if it's still doing it. You can log the sensor And if you've got the capability to do it, and just see if you fire it up and it goes 30 psi or 40 psi and then 0, or 40 psi, 120 psi and 0. You just want to make sure that it isn't the sensor first and you're doing the right way. Sovereign saying ES350. Yep. Mike G's asking, the great debate, do you pre-fill your oil filters? Yes, I do. In fact, it's one of the things that I have always done is pre-fill my filters. Saying he's a fan of dry install them, flood mode for a few seconds to prime the filter myself. So I will do a little bit of both sometimes, but I like to pre-fill the filter. So yes, I always pre-fill it. Sovereign saying, and make sure the seal is oiled. Yes, and also make sure that the seal from their gasket from the other filter is not stuck on the engine still. Sovereign saying, Dodge builds brute force are basically bodybuilders, not athletes. Kinda. They certainly look the part. Cody's saying aerodynamics are worse than a lobster. Actually, lobsters are way more aerodynamic. Oh, he's talking about Toyota reliability. Yeah, those things are crazy when it comes to reliability, the older Toyotas especially. At 85 4x4, 250,000 miles. Oh, yeah. The thing is that those trucks will take hard mileage. Toyotas take hard mileage really well. It's not so much that you can get 250,000 miles out of one. We got trucks in the fleet. These are all 2017 Hemi Dodge trucks that have over 300,000 miles on them with very few issues other than body control modules seemingly being the latest issue. But that being said, you've got a Toyota that it will handle getting beat to death for 250,000 miles. In a way that most other manufacturers' vehicles simply can't deal with. Someone's saying, I love me some Challenger body style. I'll sacrifice some aero for that badass retro look. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I'm a sucker for the looks of my car, man. I really do like the way that car presents itself. Bernie's asking, what diff would I recommend for a 2011 Dodge Charger RT? Man, depends on what you're going to do with it. 309 limited slips, probably the first answer to that question that comes straight to mind. The 370, these are all Gay-Trag rear ends. You can go 370 if you wanted to. That's going to be kind of pricey though. So for the most part, 309 limited slip will pretty much be the first and last answer. I have driven one with a 392 limited slip and a 3.92 gear ratio, and that was pretty spunky. Oh, Sovereign's hanging out with Hemi Head. Yep. Cody's saying, I feel like 100,000 miles on a Toyota is braking miles. Yeah, for sure. Big Chillin's asking, can a regular 717 Hellcat be as fast as a red eye with mods? Yeah, mine is. Actually, kind of faster than most red eyes. And it's just a Hellcat with, well, basically the configuration is Demon or 1320 as delivered one seat, really. And I did a couple of videos that illustrate all of that. That little guy right there and right there. So yeah, it can be easily faster than a red eye. Thing is though, red eyes will always get out on a Hellcat because that freaking big supercharger makes so much power at the hit. Sovereign's hanging out with Cody. Let's see. And he's saying, yep, didn't baby that truck. I lived in the Sierras and it went four-wheeling all the time, including Rubicon, of course, 5 months of snow. Yep. So we're saying 2.5 liter in the IS 350. Yeah, the ES, I'm just thinking about the ES, the one that's basically the old Camry. God, man, I'd seen those cars just absolutely take a beating. Just in a bad way, but we're saying ES is rear wheel or front wheel. IS is rear. Okay. Yeah, the IS is that little one. Didn't it have an inline six or something like that? Anyway, I'm just thinking about the ES right now. All right, so now we got Toyota chat going. No, but I did want to talk, getting back to the supercharger thing. For guys that want to spend the money, it's probably gonna surprise some folks when you find out how much money it really can be to supercharge the Gen 3. But look, at least you've got the ability to sell those parts when you get done with them and move on, and somebody else can have them. And it's really not like you're beating up a supercharger when it's on your car. It's just kind of doing supercharger stuff. So, typically I wouldn't have any issues buying used supercharger kits, but you will have to send, like, a Pro Charger is always good to send out for rebuild if you decide you want to buy a used kit. The positive displacement supercharger kits, it's always good to have them, take them to a machine shop, make sure all the mating surfaces are flat. You always want to make sure that when you install those, that they are torqued down properly. The reason for that is you don't want to warp the case or anything. But again, it's, for the guys that really want to make the power that the supercharger is going to provide, just remember that everything that's associated with that engine making that much power can potentially break in spectacular fashion. Talking about you, HB70 transmission. And again, in that video, I know I was talking about a value proposition, but I jumped on the thing for the nitrous oxide, just basically shot it down, because it's been my experience working with guys. They don't want to spend the money on nitrous oxide because somewhere along the way, people were convinced that nitrous oxide is this cheap, easy way to make horsepower. And the reality is that it's reliable if you've got the right controllers. For these modern engines, these blocks are already handling significantly more power than the blocks were handling from the factory stock, in other words. Back in the day, they can handle more power from a nitrous kit because they're already way under stressed. Modern engines spinning at modern RPMs, making modern power, yeah, that can already be putting the engine at or giving the engine a much narrower window for modification and throwing power at it. So again, that's the reason why I didn't want to, hang too much on the nitrous oxide. The idea that nitrous oxide was going to be like some kind of value proposition. It's like it is, but it's not. And then you kind of get into the whole care and feeding of your nitrous oxide system with the solenoid replacements and things like that. It turns into a big mess when guys aren't swapping those things out. And I've got a couple of horror stories with, luckily it was fuel solenoid or nitrous solenoids that didn't fire with only the fuel solenoid firing. Big Chill's asking, is a 3.0 worth a change on a Hellcat? So it depends on what you're going to do with it. I guess my question to that is, what are your goals for your Hellcat? Do you want to make 1,000 horsepower to the rear wheels? You're going to run the thing on corn. Um, in that case, a 3.0 is going to help you out a lot more than the IHI or the 2.7 that would come from the factory, or the factory offerings, I should say. Mainly because the 3.0 has lower inertial drag and has a better thermal efficiency than most of the other aftermarkets, with the only exception of that being the Elephant Supercharger by IHI. It's visually identical to the 2.7 or the 2.4 for the Hellcat variants, but the rotor pack is completely different. It's a shame they don't make that available. But at any rate, man, it just depends on what you're looking to do. You, at the same boost level, will probably pick up, I think you might pick up like 30 or something like that horsepower just with the higher efficiency of the 3.0, like 30 to 50 horsepower. I forget what the number was because there's been a lot of jibber jabber back and forth with that thing. But going 3.0 is definitely a step in the right direction if you want to make really good power with a supercharger that is going to have, again, better thermal efficiency. That's just a fancy way to say it's not going to create as much heat. And it's got a bigger issue is better inertial efficiency, meaning it doesn't take as much to actually spin the rotors and spool that thing up. Basically, the rotor pack is lighter. That's a big deal when it comes to parasitic losses. And that's the biggest issue that you're going to have with a positive displacement supercharger, is that it has significant parasitic losses. The higher RPM you go with it, the higher those parasitic losses are going to be. Oh, Hemi saying, when I got my Scat Pack, I figured I'd be in a Hellcat in a couple of years, but honestly, it's been 4 years and I still love my Scat. Would love to get into a Hellcat someday, but not until prices come down. Pricing is out of this world right now. Sovereign saying, I've been a sucker for Supercharger more than turbos. The thing is that depending on where you're from and depending on who you've been around or talked to, Superchargers have just been sexed up a whole hell of a lot more than turbos. Mainly because turbos weren't really, how do you put it? Turbos just really weren't all that popular. They've been around for, the thing about it is that turbos have been around forever and ever and ever. You just never saw anybody hanging a turbo out of the hood of a V8. You know, it never worked out. It was always the Supercharger. But guys were experimenting with turbos a long time ago. And I mean, you got to remember that the Superchargers, you had centrifugal and real root style superchargers hanging off the front of 4-cylinder and inline 6-cylinder and inline 8-cylinder engines from like the early 19 teens. Turbos really didn't come into their own primarily because of metallurgy concerns. They would basically fail due to the heat. Once they got all that stuff figured out, though, turbos obviously were the way to go. They got most of that figured out in the late 19 teens. You really started to see all the development with turbos at about that time for aircraft engines. All of the NACA results, which was what NASA would have been way back then, NACA, they were getting all of the data at about that time for turbos at varying altitudes. And that's really where they figured out, hey, wait a minute, if we can make turbos work from a plumbing standpoint, you can have the same manifold pressure at 30,000 feet, for example, that you could at, sea level, or thereabouts, say 5,000 feet. So really cool stuff with that. That's where all that technology comes from. All this technology, by the way, that we're talking about is ancient technology. It's really fuel quality is what determines the amount of power, and the metallurgy is what determines the amount of power that engines would make, really from 1923. So basically literally 100 years ago, on up. The valve geometry, the camshaft technology, all of them were overhead cam, all of them were 4-valve heads. All that stuff was developed then. As long as the metallurgy was there and you had the right octane fuel, you can make the same power back then as you can now. It ain't no different. Fuel delivery is a little bit different, obviously, but. Mike's asking, for non-Brembo style brakes on a Chally, do you recommend any brand? I like Power Stop, what is it? The 26s is what I'm running on mine. I like those. Big Chill said, I would like to see a 1320 with a twin turbo setup. Man, I think there might be one running around with that Hellion twin turbo kit. That particular setup, I think it's got a 4 fuel system. Anyway, the cool thing about the Hellion is you can't see it just looking in the engine compartment. But yeah, 1320 with a twin turbo would be pretty sick. The other thing, so talking about supercharging and forced induction in general, the one thing about turbos is because they have less parasitic loss, you will make more power with the turbo than you will with any other belt-driven supercharging solution, manifold pressure generating solution. But again, though, it comes at the cost of packaging, man. And the one had to have been the Hellion. The one that I saw, it was just the way that it's packaged is, I mean, you really concern yourself with, am I going to rub a turbo over a speed bump? What happens if something hits one of these things? It's all packaged right there in the belly where the catalytic converters are, basically. It's just, it takes up a bit more room because the whole system is about like that big around. So, but they work good. The Sovereign's loving him some 1320. Said he'd be really happy with his cat. I hear that. Hemis out. Saying, got to hit the rack. Thanks for the Mopar chat. Thank you, brother. X is in. Say, what up, Professor B? I like it. Got the flex. Yeah. Sovereign's checking out with Hemi. Let's see. He's saying, Hemi Burnout saying, what's up? Checked in late. It's all good, brother. Sovereign's saying internal combustion engines have come a long way. You know what's funny? The internal combustion engine hasn't come very far. It's the economies of scale to build them the way that engineers were designing them over 100 years ago is what's come so far. Metallurgy being a big part of that, though. Sovereign saying he's surprised that Racer X's Hellion survived. Yeah, they took a pretty nasty hit. For sure. Actually, you know, talking about internal combustion engines coming a long way, it's actually the fuel delivery. It's fuel delivery and timing that have come the farthest. You know, the basic engine design has not changed. A lot of people they're a bit shocked when they hear that the original aircraft engines from back then that were being developed, although they're kind of hard to recognize as engines today because they literally had a crankcase, which is where the term comes from. And then on that crankcase, you had cylinders which would either be pressed or screwed in. And, you know, overhead cams and all of that were just normal. So it's weird. The stuff that we consider like, oh, that's an overhead cam engine, that's fancy or whatever. It's like, they literally were doing that from the very, very, very beginning. In fact, there was no concept of an in-block cam because there wasn't a block to put it in. The only thing that the crankcase held was the crank. That's why it was called the crankcase. You cylinders and cylinder heads. And in some cases, the cylinder head, what you would consider the cylinder head, which is the valves and the springs and where the cams rode, was actually part of the cylinder itself. If you can imagine that. So you would actually have this, each cylinder would have its own cam bearing, its own valves, and its own springs and its own keepers on top of this cylinder that was screwed into what would be the crankcase. And then you would have to line the cams. Oh, it's just a complete disaster. Anyway, there's some crazy stuff going on with engines back in the day. Cody's saying he wishes the Charger RTs were cheaper, but the 392s, you can get them for half the price they were originally. That's true. Big Chell saying, when do you expect prices to drop? Prices are ridiculous, man. Look, I'll put it to you like this. As long as there's problems getting chips, you're going to have problems getting new cars, or any cars for that matter. You're just going to supply and demand. There's a whole lot of supply out there, or there's not a whole lot of supply out there, and there's a lot of demand for cars like this. So, I don't know. They're talking about sometime in the middle of this year. I doubt it. I'm going to say we're probably going to be into 23 before we start seeing any real, I don't know, any real pressure taken off of the market in terms of market value. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. And again, the longer it takes and the harder it is to get those chips, the more it's just going to keep those prices elevated. But we'll see. X is having problems hooking up on the street. I understand completely. It's a problem we all share. Oh, Simon said, I want to say they came a long way for efficiency and power. Kind of. See, the problem is that we have access to high octane fuel today. Where you find efficiency and power, again, is going to be in power to weight ratio of the engine itself, but it all has to do with the octane, the compression ratios that you can run. For boosted application, the amount of manifold pressure that you can run. But a lot of it is RPM based as well. There's a lot of interesting things that, like if you were to take let me give you a perfect example of this. Allison 1710, it's an aircraft engine. It was also used in boats, things like that. Primarily a aircraft engine is what you would associate it with. Think of it like in a P40 with a single stage supercharger. Again, 1710 cubic inch V12. That engine, based on born stroke, at 3,000 RPM. And you go, 3,000 RPM, that's not all that fast. Well, that engine at 3,000 RPM had the same piston speed as a 5-liter would have at 6,000 RPM. So the cylinder, in terms of G-force loads, was taking the same hit that you would find in a modern V8, or at least, like a 5.0, like 2-valve 5.0, like as a Windsor would be running at 6,000 RPM with a 3-inch stroke. So it's just some things because that engine had a 6-inch stroke. So yeah, sort of, but there's a lot of things that we kind of sort of take for granted today that were actually really impressive by today's standards back then. Cody's saying, how are EVs going to solve the chip problem when they need one too? They're not. Siren's saying, B Mason knows his stuff. Thank you, buddy. Siren's asking, did they have variable valve timing back then? They had a rudimentary form of variable valve timing, yes. They also had manual timing retard and timing advance. The valve timing was done, I think they would retard the cam to start and then advance the cam along with timing. But yeah, they had some rudimentary versions of that back then as well. And it was all just basically lever operated. They were working on mechanical computers to try to manage a lot of that. But yeah, they had versions of that. And I had no idea. A lot of folks don't. Yeah, it's a rudimentary version of what you see today. Obviously very analog. But Yeah, they did have stuff like that back then. They were working on it for sure. And guys, with that, we are coming up on 2 hours, so I got to wrap it up. I want to thank each and every one of you guys for hanging out with me. Would not do this without you. Love each and every one of y'all. So get out there and do something cool for somebody. With that, if you're going to sit and don't better keep your shiny side up, fellas, we will catch y'all on the next one. Ray, miss and love you, brother. That's a wrap. Adios.